Our scripture reading this morning is found in Matthew, the 27th chapter, 11 through 26. Matthew 27, 11 through 26. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor questioned him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said to him, "It is as you say." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testified against you?" And he did not answer him with regard to even a single charge. So the governor was quite amazed. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the people any one prisoner whom they wanted. At that time, they were holding a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when the people gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas, or Jesus, who is called the Christ?" For he knew that because of the envy they had handed over. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a message saying, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him." But the chief priest and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to put Jesus to death. But the governor said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called the Christ?" They all said, "Crucify him." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they kept shouting all the more, saying, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather than a riot was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to that yourselves." And all the people said, "His blood shall be on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas for them, but after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to the crucified. Such is a reading.
The Jews did not like the Romans, and the Romans did not like the Jews. The Jews did not like the Romans because the Roman Empire was in power at the time, and they were the ultimate governing authority over the Jewish people in Palestine. On the other hand, the Romans could care less about the Jews. They didn't see things their way, they didn't do things their way, but they still had to keep the Jews in check. They had to keep them in compliance according to the laws of the Roman Empire, but at the same time simply so that no such thing as an insurrection would take place, where there would be someone who would rise up in their midst and try to topple the governing Roman body. And yet these two people had to live together. The Jews had to deal with the Romans, and the Romans had to deal with the Jews. And this morning, we take a look at a transition from a meeting where Jesus faced Annas and Caiaphas, the high priests of the day, last week. We take that this morning, and we transition to where they are moved from Caiaphas over to see Pilate. Gentlemen, you're going to have to help me with the PowerPoint because it's not working up here. All right, there we go. So Matthew chapter 27, verses 1 and 2, somewhat where we left off last week, we read, "When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him to Pilate, the governor." The chief priests, the leaders of the Jews, took Jesus from their interrogation of the Messiah, and they transferred him over to the local Roman authority, a man by the name of Pilate. And that's why this morning we're going to take a look at Jesus before this Roman governor by the name of Pilate. And we're going to be examining specifically the text of Matthew chapter 27, verses 11 through 26, as Bob read for us just a moment ago. But I also want you, those of you who are taking notes, want you to be aware of those parallel passages from Mark 15, Luke 23, and also John 18 and 19. Passages that we're going to reference throughout the course of this study. There are two things that we're going to accomplish this morning. We are going to take a look at a great examination of Matthew chapter 27, and we're going to derive from Matthew chapter 27 5 points. But then we're going to take a look at one of the other gospel accounts. That gospel account which is not considered one of the synoptic or similar gospels that we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We're going to take a look at a more extensive study in the book of John closer toward the end of the lesson. But right now, let's take a look at our text, and let's take a look at our first point this morning, which comes from verses 11 through 14, and that is Pilate's amazement at Jesus. If you take a look at verses 11 through 14, you're going to see that although Jesus has been asked similar questions by the chief priests and the rulers of the law, by the high priest Caiaphas, when Jesus stands before Pilate, the very first thing that Pilate asks him is, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, why would he ask that question? Well, because a Roman governor needs to understand if there's a new king on the block, if there's a new leader amongst the Jewish people, someone who might pose a threat to the Romans, someone who is establishing himself without the authority or the permission of the Roman government. Are you the king of the Jews? Now, we are already used to seeing Jesus being silent on certain occasions before Caiaphas, and Jesus is going to be silent during certain parts of this discussion today. But at this moment in time, Jesus answers Pilate, and he says, "It is as you say." Well, you can imagine that was enough for the chief priests and the rulers who were present to just send them into another one of their frenzies. And it says that they continued to accuse Jesus. But in verse 12 we read, "He did not answer." Then Pilate said to him, verse 13, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" And once again, Jesus remains silent. He did not answer, the Bible says, a single charge. And both here in Matthew 27 and in Mark 15:15, we read that Pilate was amazed. Why? Why would Pilate be amazed? Well, I want you to think about something for just a moment. There was a reason, and every time I start getting into legal terms, I worry about this section over here, which has a couple of attorneys present, and so I have to be careful. But let's just say I've watched enough TV to know that the defense counsel does not want to always put his or her client on the stand. That can be very incriminating to their defense. A lot of times it's because you don't want your client saying the wrong thing or not saying the right thing. And if you look at this account of Jesus, he not only says, perhaps from a legal standpoint, from somebody who would be defending him in a court of law, he not only says the wrong thing, but he doesn't say the right thing. Think about this for just a minute. If you're before a Roman governor, a person who has the power to do just about anything with your life, and you declare to him that you are a new king, that you are a new authority on the block, that you are the ultimate leader of all of the Jewish people, and you have not sought their permission or been granted their okay for such a thing, that's probably, from a legal standpoint, not the thing you want to say. And yet think of all of the things that he could have said. Think of all of the evidence that he could have presented. not only to establish who exactly he was, but of his innocence of the charges. Remember last week that they're trying to find so many charges against him that based on his character, they just didn't seem to stick. We're going to see the same thing today. Pilate, time and time again, is going to say, I don't see how this guy's guilty. I don't see how this man should be here. He's certainly done nothing worthy, even in your accusations. He's done nothing worthy of death. I find him to be innocent. Jesus could have contributed to the evidence. He could have made the case just simply overwhelming to where Pilate just had no reasonable, rational choice but to release him. And yet, Jesus gives no defense. He says, I am who you say I am, but I'm not going to defend it anymore. He remains silent on every single charge. I also want you to take a look at something that's really not included in Matthew, but it's something we need to consider, just like we considered very shortly last week how Jesus was brought before Annas before he was brought to Caiaphas. In the midst of his discussion with Pilate, Pilate actually sends Jesus away to the local Herod. And if you'll turn in your Bibles with me to Luke chapter 23, verses 5 through 12. Luke chapter 23, verses 5 through 12. We're going to see how the first discussion with Pilate comes to an end and how Pilate sends him to the local Jewish authority. In Luke 23, beginning in verse 5, they kept on insisting, this is talking about the chief priests and the scribes, saying about Jesus, he stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, notice that word, even as far as this place. Now, why the significance of Galilee? Look at the next verse, verse 6. When Pilate heard it, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, I guess one could say at this point he passed the buck. He deferred him to a different authority. You chief priests, you scribes, you Pharisees, you rulers of the law, you're Jews. Jesus is a Jew. He's from a Jewish jurisdiction. Let Herod deal with him. And so he sent him to Herod, who himself also was in Jerusalem at that time. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. And he questioned him at some length. Is it any wonder that we're about to read what we're about to read? He questioned him at some length, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing him vehemently. And Herod with his soldiers, after threatening him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Now look at verse 12. It's a very interesting verse. Now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for they had been enemies with each other prior to that time. You ever heard that saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend? I wonder almost if that's what's going on here a little bit. If the Jews' hatred of Jesus and the Romans' disdain for all things Jewish was not the catalyst that brought Herod and Pilate into a friendship. But at this point in time, Herod's not getting anywhere because Jesus is not answering him. So Herod sends him back to Pilate. And in verses 15 through 18 of Matthew 27, and also verses 20 through 23, we see Pilate's solution to the problem. In verses 15 through 18, we find out that there is a tradition that the governor at this time of year would release a prisoner to make the people happy. You would think that they would want somebody who they believed to be not a criminal, somebody that they thought would continue to contribute to society in some way. At that time, verse 16, they were holding a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Mark chapter 15 and verse 17 tells us that Barabbas was a murderer who himself was involved in insurrection. In other words, an attempt to try to overthrow the government. Maybe Pilate chose Barabbas because of all of the terrible things he had done, and if anybody is worthy of a pardon, although his obvious guilt, maybe he would be appealing to the people. But what's interesting is, when Pilate suggests this, the people gather together and he says, "Whom do you want me to release, Barabbas or Jesus?" And in verse 20, before perhaps the crowds can answer, we read that the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas. That doesn't make sense to Pilate. And Pilate says to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release?" And now, in unified voices, they all cry out, "Barabbas." Pilate's left with a quandary. What am I going to do with Jesus? And they shouted, "Crucify him, crucify him." And he asks them, "What evil has he done?" And in typical mob mentality, they simply continue to chant and cry out, "Crucify him, crucify him." In Luke chapter 23, we find a little bit of insight into Pilate. Not only in Luke 23, verses 13 through 17, and specifically in verse 14, does Pilate say, "I have found no guilt in the man." In verse 15, he says, "Nor has Herod found any guilt in the man." The two governing authorities, at least as is recognized by the Romans, Pilate says, "We've not found any guilt in him. Certainly nothing," verse 15, "deserving death has been done by him." What we learn about Pilate is that Pilate does not really intend to send him to the cross. He does not intend to send him to his death. In fact, he makes the statement, "Therefore I will punish him and I will release him." We even read in Luke 23 and verse 20 that Pilate wanted to release Jesus and addressed him again. And in verse 22 of Luke chapter 23, Pilate said to the crowd a third time, he said, "Why? Why do you want to crucify him? Why Barabbas? Why? What evil has this man done? I have found no guilt in him, demanding death. Therefore, I will punish him and release him." He assumes everybody's going to release Jesus. Comparing Jesus to Barabbas is like night and day, or perhaps day and night, to be consistent. Why would you want to release Barabbas? Here's what I'm going to do. Since I find Jesus to be not guilty, I'll release him. It'll curry favor with the people, it will maintain the traditions, and it will hopefully keep things at civil rest between the Romans and the Jews. That brings us to something kind of interesting. Because if you notice up on the board, you'll notice that Pilate's solution is found in verses 15 through 18, and then we skip a verse, and it continues in verses 20 through 23. That's because there's a fourth point that I want to make that's only found in verse 19, and that is Pilate's warning. His warning from his wife. And verse 19 reads, "While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a message saying, 'Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him.'" Matthew's the only person that talks about this. And as much as you might see on the PowerPoint behind me, I'd love to turn your attention at this point to 2 Opinions chapter 2 and verse 4 so that I can give you some kind of enlightenment as to what this verse is all about. That's not a book of the Bible. And so let me give you Kevin's opinion. We don't have a lot of detail on this. A lot of commentators don't give much commentary because there's not much detail on this. But wouldn't it be nice If Pilate could have turned to 2 Opinions chapter 2 and verse 4, that verse of Scripture that teaches so very clearly, whatsoever a wife demandeth of thee, also shall ye give her. Things might have changed for Pilate if he'd listened to that, but that's not there. Did she just have a dream? Possibly. Had she heard about Jesus in the background and this was working on her subconscious? Possibly. Had she heard about the great things that he had done over the last 3 to 3.5 years of his ministry in and around that location, and she was having a difficult time reconciling that with the charges that were being levied against him? Perhaps. But as the Bible is filled with God sending messages through visions and dreams to both the righteous and the unrighteous alike, I can't help but think that somehow she received this dream from an inspired source. Just my opinion. But what I do know is fact is that she is so convicted with what she has dreamed that she sends a message to her husband, declaring to her husband that the man who stands before him is righteous. And she says, have nothing to do with that righteous man, because I suffered last night. I didn't just have a dream, I had a nightmare because of the man who stands before you. Do not do anything to this righteous man. Well, Pilate did not heed the warning of his wife. In fact, ultimately, his decision is one that gives heed to the mob. And in verses 24 through 26, Matthew writes, when Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, he wasn't getting anywhere. He could have just said, "Be gone with you, annoying people. Let this man who is innocent of all charges depart from my midst." But because he was accomplishing nothing, and because verse 24 says that there seems to be a riot that is starting to develop, he nips it in the bud. He takes water and washes his hands in front of the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood." Now this is indicative of the culture of the day. Goes all the way back even into the Old Testament times, where there's a passage in Psalm 26 and verse 6 that reads, "I shall wash my hands in innocence." And this was the idea. Not only when you went before the altar of the Lord would you cleanse yourself, but this was a symbolic cleansing. And although Pilate has the authority here, although he has guards there to protect him and to silence the people, he does what the mob wants him to do. So as some way perhaps to artificially cleanse his conscience, he washes his hands and he says, "Okay, I'm not responsible," when in fact he was very responsible. He was just as responsible for Jesus going to the cross as the accusers who brought Jesus before him. There's a question that's always asked: did the Jews send Jesus to the cross, or did the Romans? And the answer is yes. Because the Jews were the ones who were building this case against him, although a case built on a house of cards. But it was the Romans who had the authority for capital punishment. And it was Pilate who had the ability to free Jesus on the spot, no questions asked. But there was a riot brewing. Mark 15 and verse 15 suggests that he was wanting to satisfy the crowd. Luke chapter 23 and verse 23 reads that the crowd was insistent, with loud voices asking that he be crucified, and their voices began to prevail. There is a suggestion here that Pilate in some way sees a problem brewing that might very soon get out of hand, might even get out of hand for him, and so he makes the call. If you want me to release Barabbas, a man who's clearly guilty, and if you want me to crucify Jesus, a man in whom I find no guilt, fine. I wash my hands of the whole situation. I want you to look up on the board for just a moment. Scan all of the verses that I've got there, because you might remember in the opening slide where we talked about not only we'd be studying Matthew 27, but the various parallel accounts from Mark, Luke, and John. You'll notice up on the slide behind me that there are no references to John. And that's because John, the one of the four gospel accounts that's not considered a part of the synoptic gospels, or the gospels that are similar to one another, but often very different, gives us detail unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if you would, for just a moment, I'd like for you to turn there with me to John chapter 18, beginning in verse 28. John chapter 18, beginning in verse 28. And I want you to read with me, in some ways, a synopsis of what we've already read, but with great detail that we have not encountered. And I want you to kind of take a look at this as a summation of the lesson from John's point of view. In John chapter 18, beginning in verse 28, John wrote, "Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium. And it was early, and they themselves did not enter into the praetorium, so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover." In other words, they did not want to go into the presence of those dirty Gentiles. Verse 29, "Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, 'What accusation do you bring against this man?' They answered and said to him, 'If this man were not an evildoer, we would have not delivered him to you.'" I can only imagine if our local judge has ever said to people who have come into his court after hearing the evidence, "Why in the world are you here? Is that all you've got?" You and I both know that there are lots of people in this world that are tying up the time of our courts with frivolous lawsuits. Things that just don't even make sense. Things that don't make sense because things in the past haven't made sense. Do you realize today that there are stickers on certain lawnmowers, on push lawnmowers, that say you cannot trim your hedges with it? There's a reason for that. And that's because a man years ago, after mowing his lawn, wanted to clip his hedges. Not having a hedge trimmer, he decided to pick up an already working and turned on lawnmower to trim his hedges. Chopped his fingers off. He sued the company because they didn't have a sticker warning him not to use the lawnmower as a hedge trimmer. And he won. I love the response. Pilate says, "Why are you here?" And their response is, "Well, if we didn't have a good reason for being here, then we wouldn't be here. So clearly we've got a good reason for being here." I want to put a sticker on them. Look at verse 31. "So Pilate said to them, 'Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law.' The Jews said to him, 'We are not permitted to put anyone to death.'" Remember, they're under Roman occupation. Verse 32, "To fulfill the word of Jesus which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. Therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' Jesus answered, 'Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?' Pilate answered, 'I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. What have you done?' Jesus answered, 'My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. Therefore Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" You realize that's a question that people are asking today? What is truth? Your truth? My truth? Well, your truth is just as good as my truth. My truth's just as good as your truth. You may call that black, I may call that white. That's true for you and true. No. Do you realize there was a survey taken many years ago, but in this more modern age, and the survey established that 2 out of 3 Americans did not believe in such a thing as an absolute truth, something that was absolutely true for all people at all times in all places. You understand? 66% of our nation says there's no such thing as an absolute truth. And I promise you, since that survey was taken, that number has declined. Because today, you can make up anything you want to. Somebody can come out and say the sky is blue, and you can say, no, we're in the middle of a thunderstorm. There are people today who wake up one day one gender and turn around and say the next day, I'm a different gender. And we are being taught as a society that whatever's true for you must be true for everyone. What is truth? Pilate said to him. And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then that I release for you the King of the Jews? So they cried out again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. John 19, continuing in verse 1. Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and put a purple robe on him. And they began to come up to him and say, Hail, King of the Jews, and to give him slaps in the face. Pilate came out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I have found no guilt in him. Jesus then came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, Behold, the man. So when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, Crucify, crucify. Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and by that law he ought to die because he made himself out to be the Son of God. I want you to notice their words. Romans aren't worried about Jewish law, so it would make little sense for them to really bring this up. But Romans were worried about anybody who posed a threat to Romanism. So notice what he says. The chief priests come back and they say, he's claiming to be a god. He's claiming to be someone who would rival Caesar. Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. And he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave no answer. So Pilate said to him, You do not speak to me? Do you know that I have authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you? Jesus, the Son of God, the person who is in a particular position of authority, not only over Caesar, but over this local Roman governor. Jesus answered, You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin. As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. Who are you more afraid of? God or Caesar? Now, if I ask that question today, who are you more afraid of, God or a king, if we lived in an earthly kingdom? Or who are you more afraid of, God or a dictator, if we lived under some kind of dictatorship? Or who are you more afraid of, God or the president, in which we do live under a president today? If we lived under, however, the worst tyrant the world had ever known, who would you be afraid of? God or that tyrant? If you've only ever experienced the tyrant, or if the vast majority of your experience is with that tyrant, even though you know in the back of your mind intellectually that a God is supposed to have greater power than any human being, you might be more afraid of the human, because that's been your experience. I want you to think about something. That's been our experience. We understand earthly leaders. We understand earthly people who are in authority over us, and we are oftentimes fearful of them. Now, by faith, we know about the one true God of the Bible. And by faith, we know how to respect and revere and live in awe of Him. But are you expecting that Pilate had that same knowledge? Do we expect that Pilate would have the same appreciation for the Creator of all that we do? Remember, Pilate was a Roman. He was a polytheist. He believed in many gods, and he'd never met one of them because they were all false. Now he's being introduced to evidence about the one true God. But before he has the ability to consider that too long, those chief priests and scribes say, hey, what this guy's doing is wrong. He's not just opposing us. He's not just opposing you. He's opposing Caesar. Are you afraid of God or of Caesar? In verse 13, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, behold, your king. So they cried out, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? Listen to this. The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. We have no king but Caesar. Of course you have him a king. You're Jews, aren't you? You observe the law of Moses, don't you? You respect the prophecies of the Old Covenant, don't you? Aren't you looking forward to a Messiah? Aren't you looking forward to the anointed one coming? Aren't you looking forward to the coming king? I would have loved it if somebody had stood up and said, aren't we praying that the coming king will come and overthrow the Romans? Because that's what a lot of them in that day hoped for. That's what many expected out of Jesus. But their response is, we have no king but Caesar. That wasn't a Roman response. That was a Jewish response. That was the response of the leaders. That was a response of the preachers. That was a response of the elders of the day. We have no king but Caesar. How does that even relate to our lives? It's real simple. What are we afraid of? What do we really fear? I'm afraid that when persecution comes our way, sometimes what we really fear and what we fear most is what can be done to us, what can be said about us, our reputation, our image, maybe even our personal safety and protection. That's why so many people give in to persecution. But we read so many times in the Bible and so many times in the New Testament, followers of Christ, like Stephen, like so many of the apostles, willing to and even going to their deaths to stand up for the truth, a truth that is true for all people, everywhere, all of the time. And that is the truth that Jesus Christ is the Son of the living God. He is our Savior. He was and is our sacrifice. And He is greater than all others. At the name of Jesus, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. The question is, will we be wise enough to figure that out today, or will we wait until it's too late? Pilate had all of the evidence in the world, even including a request from his wife to let Jesus go. But he gave in to the mob. We have mobs in our lives. Sometimes that mob is our family. Sometimes that mob are our friends. Sometimes that mob are our close working relationships. Sometimes it's society as a whole. People who are constantly putting pressure on us to refuse the authority of Jesus and accept a lesser authority over Him. But stand strong. Be firm. As Paul would say to the church at Corinth, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. Because no matter what we face in this life, if we can stand true to Him, with Him supporting and strengthening us at our side, then we will look forward to an eternal home in heaven, where there is no pain, where there is no suffering, where there are no tears. There is simply everlasting life with our God. So the question this morning is, what are you afraid of? I hope that it's truly nothing in this world in comparison to God. And I hope your fear in God is not one that has you cowering in a corner, but one that simply exists out of awe for who He is and what He has done for you and me. Fear the Lord. That was Solomon's conclusion after a life of sin and immorality. Fear God and keep His commandments. Will you do that this morning? If so, we encourage you to respond to the invitation of Christ while together we stand and sing.